Here we go. No conflicts to declare. So I'm going to show the funding sources at the end of the talk. No direct financial benefit from any of the research that I'm talking about. And the funding for our current organization is from donors that have no stake in a relationship, stake or relationship with the organization or the work. So the main goal of what I want to talk about today is that we are in the age of pandemics, the pandemic era, and the things that are driving them are the same issues that are driving the global breakdown of climate, of our land, deforestation, land use change, our oceans, and our environment in general. And this is an environmental issue. And I want to talk about how we can dig through some of the science to understand how we can predict, what are the limits of prediction, and what we can do with that to try and prevent pandemics. And I'm talking about real prevention here. The idea is to not just do preparedness, but to actually try and reduce the number of pandemics in the future and even stop them. So first of all, why is this a big issue? Well, we've come out of COVID, but these are rare events, these large global pandemics. But actually, if you start looking at the underlying spillover events that drive pandemic risk, they're very common. We get about 5 new emerging diseases every year, completely new diseases in people. And about 3 of those are zoonotic. And we know that through going through the literature and digging out a few hundred cases of previous emerging diseases, looking at the point origins of those, where we know them, or the best guess of that, and what's causing that. And really importantly, this zoonotic group is rising at a far faster rate than the rest. These are the pathogens that come from animals, primarily wildlife, mainly viruses, and they're the ones that tend to become pandemic. Every known pandemic for the past few hundred years is a zoonotic agent that came from animals. So that's the biggest risk to us, and so was COVID-19. And if you look at the trajectory of those pandemics, of these emerging disease events, they're rising in a non-linear fashion. So that means they're accelerating in frequency. They're spilling over more often. And because we live in a globalized planet, they spread more quickly through travel and trade. And we depend on that global trade network for our welfare and our economies. So they crash our economies quicker. And it's quite striking when you look at some of the recent outbreaks. Just over the last 20 years or so, 30 years, outbreaks have tended to have a bigger economic impact once they go transnational. SARS was a significant $30 to $50 billion event. H1N1, so-called swine flu, $45 to $55 billion. There's significant financial shock to the market. But of course, the really big one was COVID-19, which is still having a financial impact, still infecting people and still causing deaths, sadly. And, early estimates of $16 trillion impact on the global economy. It's now likely to be many tens of trillions of dollars and will continue into the future. So we really pay a high price for pandemics. So preventing them and dealing with them is critical. So how do we do that? And really, there are some big questions we need to know the answers to be able to predict and therefore do something about them. So first of all, what's causing them? If we know why they're emerging at an increasing rate, we can deal with those underlying drivers. And there are some very specific high-risk activities that we can target and try and deal with and reduce risk through. Where are the new viruses, the next pandemics lurking? So we see these viruses emerge repeatedly over time. Coronaviruses, for example. Which wildlife species harbor them? Where do those wildlife live? And where are the people making contact with them? And crucially, how many of them are there? If this is a case where there are tens of millions of unknown viruses that have potential to emerge, then we have a really difficult problem to deal with, but maybe it's containable. Can we then go out to those regions and those wildlife species that we suspect are harboring the next potential pandemic, discover the viruses that they carry, and work with those viruses to understand whether they're likely to be zoonotic or not? And this is difficult and controversial, and it gets into viral evolution, which is, of course, not predictable. But there are things we can do that help. And once we've got answers to all these, part answers, whole answers, how can we actually reduce the risk? And if it's something that we really need to do, how much is it going to cost? And can we afford it? Are we going to actually pay the price for that to deal with it? And we look to climate change as an example of a big global problem like emerging diseases that we need countries to work together to deal with. And it's incredibly difficult. It's the problem of the global commons. So first of all, some of the answers to that. We have, some answers to these issues already. What's driving these emerging diseases and where are they likely to emerge next? And we worked that out, and other groups did too, through looking at past outbreaks, pinpointing the best known location of origin, and then looking at what's going on in that place that could drive humans and animals to make contact together to cause a virus to spill over and emerge. And of course, it's common sense. It's where people have the highest density, where wildlife have the highest diversity, because each species has its own group of viruses that it carries. So if you've got more species in a region, you've got likely more viruses that could emerge. But critically, in this sort of hotspots, emerging disease hotspots version 2 that we published in 2017, we were able to show for zoonoses that change to the environment drives this. So change in pasture there and urban extent. These are global data on deforestation, land use change, and are a significant driver of emerging infectious disease risk. So where people clash with wildlife and where we're making big changes to the environment, that's where we're going to see the next new emerging diseases. And we've got a map, so you can target your resources to the places most likely to foster a new emerging disease. That's useful. Next question, which species, if you're going to go out to these regions and try and look for the next emerging virus, which species should you look in? So here are all the mammalian orders. And this is data from ICTV, the viral database. This is every known host virus association. There's a few thousand of them. And if you look at each dot is a species, and that's the total number of viruses that have been described from that species in the literature. Red dots are for domestic animals or livestock, and gray are for wildlife. And what you see is a huge number of viruses and diversity in artiodactylids. This include ungulates, which of course are domestic animals. We've worked with them for a long time. We've understood more about the viruses than other groups. We've done more work, studied them better. So we drive the discovery of more viruses. There's also more of them. If you look at the proportion of the viruses that these groups carry that are known to be able to infect people, the proportion that are zoonotic, the picture's different. And the artiodactylids, the domesticated livestock, drop out as a significant group. And what you see are species that are closely related to people, like primates, because of course their viruses are likely to be more able to infect us. Other groups like bats, rodents, carnivores. You need to correct these data for the number of people that have been doing the research to discover them. Because if you've got more scientists working on one specific group that's charismatic or widespread, you're going to find more viruses. So when you put all these data into a mathematical model that dissects out these different factors, what you see are they are significantly driven by the research effort. But if you correct for that, what we see is phylogeny is important. The closer relationship a wildlife group has to people, the more emerging zoonoses that group tends to carry. And of course, that makes sense because viruses have evolved in common ancestors with us. They're therefore more likely to be able to latch onto our host cell receptors, for example, and infect us. But what's pretty striking, and we originally did this work to try and get rid of some of the hype that bats are very important reservoirs of emerging diseases, but it turns out it's true. We proved ourselves wrong, that bats actually are the only mammalian order that rises to significance in this model that shows they carry a disproportionately high number of emerging zoonoses. So bats are important, so are carnivores, so are primates and rodents. by looking at the effort spent to do research on mammalian viruses and setting the bar of the highest studied wild species, and then saying, if we did the same amount of research for every group of mammals around the world, how many viruses would they carry? We don't know exactly how many unknown viruses there are, but what we do is we get a proportion that are missing. And we can also then map out where those missing viruses are on the planet, because we know the global distribution of every mammal species pretty well at this point. So these maps show us where on the planet, if you went out to look for new viruses, you would find the most zoonotic, potentially zoonotic viruses. So Asia is for sure a hotspot for bats and for other species. But the main driver of this is the huge diversity in the Amazon, which has still not been tapped, not been looked at, and therefore presents a risk for future emergence as people start to inhabit and build roads and trade wildlife in those regions. Or maybe in a better planet in the future, we don't do that. The last question that we were able to get a handle on is, how many undiscovered potentially emerging viruses are there in wildlife? If that's the biggest risk group, knowing how big that group is pretty important. And what we did was we were able, using this work we were doing with USA program called PREDICT, where we repeatedly sampled in multiple countries, more than 20 countries around the world, in the same protocols, the same testing protocols. We did viral discovery on tens and tens of thousands of samples from wildlife. So with that amount of testing, you're able to discover new viruses. And as you start discovering new viruses, you quickly find it gets harder and harder to find new ones. And that's called a discovery curve. And when it starts to level off, it's saturated. That saturation point versus the initial acceleration of discovery against, in this case, the number of samples tested, gives you a way to estimate the total diversity of new viruses that could be discovered if you continued sampling, i.e. the total number of undiscovered viruses in that species. Now, there's lots of assumptions and guesstimates in that, but it gives us a rough number. And if you look at all mammal species using this approach, we estimate there are under 2 million unknown viruses. And of those, about 650 to 840,000 have likely zoonotic potential. Based on how commonly viruses in the ICTV database are zoonotic versus not zoonotic. So lots of assumptions, but a rough estimate tells us that this is a discoverable number. So we really could, if we really decided as a species to deal with this existential threat to us, we really could, over a short period of time, go out and discover those viruses, sequence them, work out which ones are most likely able to infect us, and actually start to design vaccines and drugs against future pandemic potential viruses. Of course, that's now become hugely controversial, but it's still the best strategy forward, and I'll show why. So what would a One Health strategy to prepare for and prevent pandemics look like? And really, the best bet we have right now, and we talked about this in a paper in PNAS a couple of years ago, is to conduct what we call smart surveillance. So surveillance, not just of people looking for the first inklings of an outbreak, because usually you're too late once the outbreak's begun. Really to look at wildlife, people, and livestock in areas where there's a lot of contact, these One Health interfaces between those groups in regions that are emerging disease hotspots. That way you increase the chances of finding not only new viruses that could be zoonotic in the future, but in places where they're likely to spill over more readily. Once you do that, you can then create risk assessments about the geography of the risk, where these viruses are likely to be found on the planet, and what behaviors and activities are going on there that could drive spillover. The second part of this approach needs to be designing vaccines and drugs that don't just work against known pathogens, but also against future potential spillover pathogens. That's already begun, and it's been done in COVID, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that's a great step forwards. And then finally, the really big problem, I think, is developing policies, national, global policies, to deal with the underlying drivers of pandemics: deforestation, climate change, wildlife trade. Developing programs to inform the public and make them aware of what they're doing that drives risk for them and for the planet, and try and deal with those big global environmental issues. And this is a really thorny problem because, of course, these things like wildlife trade and deforestation are driven by economic growth, by people's welfare increasing with an increased economy. And that's a difficult issue to deal with. It becomes very political. So let's talk about proof of concepts of this approach. So first of all, COVID-19. We look at COVID-19 and think, well, yeah, this was very similar to SARS, but it's not only similar to SARS, it's similar to a whole series of emerging coronaviruses that have spilled over, probably from wildlife, through usually or often through intermediate hosts into people or livestock. And this is a list. The full details are in the paper in PNAS of some of those significant coronaviruses. And if you look at phylogenetic reconstruction of history, you start to see of historical outbreaks, you start to find that this has been going on for hundreds of years. And some of the common coronaviruses, which we call common cold or respiratory infections now, NL63-229E, they're likely bat origin coronaviruses from the best phylogenetic research that may have come through domestic animals into people in over historical time. So COVID-19 is just another one of those many, and there are others spilling over since COVID. We all know that the best data suggest the outbreak of COVID-19 began in the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. But from my point of view, the outbreak probably started somewhere else. At least the spillover event was probably somewhere else, probably in a wildlife farm in rural China somewhere that then supplied the market. So if we go out to these areas of rural China, this is Yunnan province, very beautiful part of southwest China, we find that bats are very abundant and very diverse, fly over villages every night, fly over wildlife farms every night, fly near to cities where people live, and there's a high potential for infection. They also carry a huge diversity of coronaviruses. This is a few hundred RDRP sequences of beta and alpha coronaviruses from surveys of bats in China. Now, what is the use of that? And this is one of the criticisms of this approach. If you go out and find new viruses, you're going to find a ton of them. How do you know which ones are important? Well, we've begun to be able to show that. So this is a cave in Yunnan, where by going in repeatedly, sequencing specific regions of the coronaviruses found in bats in there, we were able to show that basically the original genetic makeup, if you like, of the SARS coronavirus still exists in that bat community, in that bat cave, in striking detail. We were able to show over the last 20 years through doing work in China and discovering a lot of new viruses, coronaviruses, that some of them are able to infect cells in the lab. They can bind to the human ACE2 receptor, they can infect cells, they can even cause disease in humanized mice. So that becomes of public health value because that tells you which viruses are therefore have potential to spill over and emerge. There's also other public health value to be gleaned from this work, which is discovery of viruses that then can be used to design broad-acting therapies or vaccines that not only are useful against COVID-19, but against future potential, what in this case, Ralph Barrett's, Tim Sheehan's group called pre-pandemic bat coronaviruses. Those pre-pandemic bat coronaviruses are viruses that our collaboration with Wuhan Institute of Virology discovered in China and were able to isolate and now are used routinely to test broad-action drugs, vaccines, therapies against COVID and other diseases. So this is proof of concept of public health value from this work. We can also fine-tune risk assessments to say, where should you do more deeper surveillance? So by looking at the bats that are known to carry SARS-related coronaviruses, where they are distributed on the planet, you can create a map of bat host species richness for SARS-related coronaviruses. We have data from a few studies in Laos, studies in China that we did, that pre-pandemic show evidence of bat coronaviruses infecting people and them developing antibodies. So by looking at the number of people that have antibodies in these surveys versus the likely time that those antibodies would persist in a person, you can generate an estimate of how many people get infected in these regions every year from bat coronaviruses. And we estimate about a median of over 66,000 people for this very big region in Southeast Asia, where SARS-related coronaviruses are spilling over into 66,000 people plus per year on average. That's quite a significant spillover interface, and one that is worth investing in to try and prevent. So what can be done? Well, here's an example of what can be directly done. This is a group of alpha coronaviruses that we discovered in a pig farm in China causing an outbreak, SADS-related, swine acute diarrheal syndrome. It kills pigs in pig farms, and it causes diarrheal disease that's pretty lethal to young pigs. And it's quite a concern for the pork industry. So we looked at the bats that host these coronaviruses. We were able to find out we just published this in MBio, which host is the most likely reservoir for these. Ralph Barrick's group did some work to show that human serum that's from people infected with NL63 and other known alpha coronaviruses of people can neutralize against this virus. So that's public health value right there. And that this virus can be inhibited with remdesivir. And there's more work going on onto that. We can also create risk maps for the pig industry of where bats and pigs overlap in Southeast Asia, and where therefore you could go in and do more detailed surveillance, make sure bats don't have access to pigs in this region, make sure you're testing the pig farm workers who work there to see if they're getting infected. So again, this gives you a strategy of how to deal with future diseases. But a very specific example is from Thailand. And this is a beautiful site in Ratchaburi, just north of Bangkok, which is a temple that is over a cave that has about 3+ million bats in them. So many bats that if you go and watch the flyout, this is just a few seconds of the flyout, which happens every night, of bats leaving the cave to go out and hunt for insects. It lasts about an hour, quite incredible. People go and watch this as a tourist thing. There's local Thai people find it fascinating and interesting. But of course, there's a risk to this. And this is inside the cave. And you'll see here, there are people in there during the day. And as you look up, you can see the bats circling in that area of the cave. Most of them are roosting, most of them are asleep, but these have been disturbed and are spinning round and around. So it's a very high-risk place to go without full PPE, mask, gloves, and eye protection. But people do that. Why do they do that? Well, they collect the feces in these caves. Once a week, they dig it out and they sell it, and it's very profitable. Each family has its own part of the cave that they've had traditionally for many years, and they make money out of it. They go in without masks, without gloves, without even shoes in many cases. They drink and eat in the cave. So it's incredibly high risk. We've done nasal swabs from some of those workers and found PCR evidence of SARS-related coronaviruses in their nostrils. So they're breathing in feces that's infected. So there's a high risk of infection. So this is not just one cave in Thailand. This happens across Southeast Asia, South Asia. People have this series of huge variety of connectivity with bats that is a high risk. And what we find is serological studies that these bat guano collectors are not just being infected with coronaviruses, they're also picking up Mojang virus, a paramyxovirus. They're picking up filoviruses. There's evidence of that. Maybe a different bat filoviruses that we don't know full details of yet. So this is a high-risk activity. And again, this has value for public health because you can talk to the local government and start to mandate hand washing, masks, restrict the other people that try and go in the cave for tourism, and just reduce risk. We were able to isolate we were able to sequence up some viruses from these fecal samples of bats in that cave. One of them was of particular interest. It was not yet published. This SARS-related virus, very close to SARS-CoV-2. The whole genome, it's not the closest. It's more distant than RATG13 and the banal group. But if you look at the spike protein, it's probably the closest to SARS-CoV-2. So this we considered a high risk, and we were concerned that this is a SARS-CoV-2 related virus that could potentially spill over. And sure enough, when we looked at ACE2 binding, this is SARS-CoV-2, and this is the new virus from Thailand we call RP65. It actually has a higher binding to human ACE2 than RATG13, very close to SARS-CoV-2. Thankfully, using a serum neutralization assay, we were able to show that people who've been infected or vaccinated against COVID are likely create a very strong reaction to neutralize this virus. So it's unlikely to be able to emerge, given that most people in the region have been infected or had the vaccine at this point. So again, direct public health value tells you what areas there are for concern and what activities are a concern, and then gives you some indication of can we do something about it. So now I want to talk about the bigger issue, which is the global threat of pandemics. And if we can, using this proof of concept that you can discover viruses in wildlife and get meaningful public health value from that, can we then scale that up to try and dig our way out of the pandemic era? And I believe we can. I'm very optimistic about it, despite the politics and the paranoia. And, even worse than that, after COVID-19, a lot of people thinking, well, we got over that. We'll just move on and forget about it. We won't have another one for 100 years. Well, it's not true, of course, because if you look at the trajectory of emerging diseases, it's non-linear. It's increasing in the rate of emergence. So if you take that underlying data and create an economic model, and this is work that Jamie Pike and others did with us, to say, what is the likely cost of pandemics in the next few decades? And if we don't do anything, is that going to increase or decline? And if we do something, how much do we need to do, and what's the return on investment? So this is trying to make the case that we should do something about this in a global scale. And it's the same model was used for climate change. So it's called an optimal stopping model. If you understand what's driving this climate change, it's the production of CO2. And if we deal with that aggressively, you reduce the impacts, the economic impacts of climate change. But if you don't do it quick enough, the economic impacts become so significant that then becomes impossible to deal with. You then move into just trying to mitigate the economic damage rather than control it and prevent it. So this stopping point, this optimal stopping period, is the period during which you need to act with a concerted global effort to do something about a rising exponential problem. So what is that time scale for pandemics, and how much would we need to invest? So if we don't do anything, we estimated, this was back in, I think, it was before the pandemic, before we knew the cost of, in modern times, of a truly global pandemic, which is tens of trillions of dollars. So we estimated $3+ trillion over 50 years. You can easily multiply that by 10 at this point. Now we know how much a global pandemic truly costs in this globalized time. If you have a 10-year program that gives you a 5% reduction in the risk of an emerging disease or the number of cases that an emerging disease leads to in people, the number of human infections. And we base the cost of that program on World Bank estimates of pandemic prevention strategies around the wildlife trade, deforestation, and climate change, how much they cost, and then how many diseases would be reduced or cases. You save a significant amount of money over the next 50 years, and you get a return on investment of about 100 to 1, which is pretty incredible for a health strategy. And of course, the reason that the return on investment is so high is because the damages caused by these pandemics are so significant and are increasing so dramatically. What's the time scale we need to act in? Well, if you look at that optimal stopping model, we have between, on the T for time, between 3 and 34 years to enact that policy before the exponential rise overwhelms our capacity to reduce it. So that's this generation, your generation. And this was published a few years ago, so we're already losing time. We really do need to take this seriously. We need to not just talk about pandemic preparedness, we need to talk about pandemic prevention, dealing with the things that cause pandemics. And this is one of them. This is the wildlife trade in China, which we were working on before the pandemic. And this is a farmer Wei, who's in a book by David Quammen, who interviews him. And every time I meet Farmer Wei, he tries to get me to eat eat the bamboo rats, which I've never done. They're quite cute, and there are other things to eat. But this is a typical wildlife farm, and this is actually quite a good one. Animals are kept very close together, multiple species bred together. People live in the barn with the animals, with a curtain between them where they sleep and where the animals are. And of course, there are civets, porcupines, bamboo rats, raccoon dogs, all mixed in. It's a perfect mixing vessel for an outbreak, and likely what happened with COVID-19. Dealing with this is not straightforward. Eating wildlife around the world is not only common, it's prized culturally. I mean, we do this in Europe too. A prime joint of venison is very expensive, or grouse in the UK. In China, the more expensive an animal is to buy and eat, the more cultural benefit you get from treating your guests to that. So when we did a survey of why people eat wildlife in China, we find that males over 30 and above with higher incomes are more likely to consume wildlife. Wealthier people showing off to their colleagues, saying, let's have a very traditional meal. I'm going to buy it, it's going to be very expensive. And that's a real problem, because the rarer an animal gets, the more expensive it is, the more social capital you get from eating it. So you drive an extinction vortex, and you also drive people to go out further and catch these animals, bring them into a city, and bring viruses in with them. So dealing with that means targeting the groups that do it, and maybe in this case, targeting younger people and saying, hey, it's not cool to eat wildlife. This is what the old folks do. You should change and rise above that. Deforestation is another huge problem, because this is a major economic incentive driving it. These are palm oil plantations in Malaysia. The Malaysian economy, it relies largely on palm oil and has done for many years now. It's a hugely profitable crop. It's hugely beneficial to local people who grow it because they get a lot of money out of it. It increases their welfare, but it completely trashes the land. There's very little biodiversity left. And in the end, it drives the emergence of malaria. And what we found is that certain diseases like leptospirosis and malaria have linked very closely to deforestation for palm oil. If you look at an economic model of how much land you would convert on the vertical axis over time, if you wanted to maximize the economic benefits to you from deforestation in Malaysia, the maximum you would do is this black line. If you incorporate the cost of the emerging diseases, you have to deforest less to get those economic benefits because you're paying for the cost of malaria cases forever once you cut down the forest. If you also include the ecosystem services that you lose, fresh water, abundant fish species, climate change mitigation, you decrease the profits even more. And sadly, in an unregulated space, the blue line is what's happened in Malaysia. So it's already been deforested to the point where they're losing money by cutting down further forests, but it still happens. So we're trying to use these arguments to persuade governments to shift the way they manage forests from an economic viewpoint. And this was a project that USAID set up in Liberia with us to protect areas of forest, to look at the economic benefits of those forests and to say, can we show benefit to local community through ecotourism? So we work with an ecotourism company. And can we reduce the number of emerging diseases? And we also worked on chimpanzee conservation as part of that. So there are strategies in place that could be scaled up. There's proof of concept that it works. What really needs to happen now is willingness of you, the next generation, because it's a generational issue now, to go out and do this and to use the best science to most effectively predict emerging diseases and then the best common sense and economics to deal with it. So just to thank all the former EcoHealth Alliance staff who worked on these projects, the many, many partners in different countries, Limphas Group in Dukanyo, Superpon and OPAS in Thailand, Chungli and Peng in Wuhan and now Guangzhou, and the funders who, unfortunately, because of the way science has gone in the US, have now all fundings from the federal government's been closed down for any of this work, which is quite sad. Nature Health Global continues to get support from private foundations and private donors and the public, and we're extremely grateful for that. Thanks very much.